let's now explore the clone stamp tool in 3D Coat. And if you have a Photoshop background, this icon is probably very familiar to you. Right here. In 3D Coat, you have a few different ways that you can orient the cloning point, and also a pivot point as well on some of these. So let's go to the first one by default, and that's translation. This is probably the most common one in Photoshop, and that is you would click to set a reference point. So in 3D Coat, it's Control click rather than Alt click in Photoshop. So again, I'll hold down the Control key and click, and so that is going to set the cloning point. So once I click with my brush, that little reference point or that cloning point is going to follow along like a lost little puppy. Okay, it's going to keep the same distance and the same orientation no matter where I go with my brush. So let's look at the next one, mirroring. And when I hit the Control key or hold the Control key and click, I don't have to hold down the cursor. Once I let up from my Control key and just start moving my brush around, again, I'm not clicking, I'm just moving my cursor around freely without pressing. Now once I left mouse click, it sets it. So now it's almost like it gave me a local symmetry plane of sorts. All right, so what I'm going to do is paint a little something here so we can see it a little bit better. And I might even use one of these brushes here. Just try to make it look a little bit more interesting than just a blob of paint. Yeah. Okay, so now that that's done, we'll go back to our clone stamp tool. And again, I can Control click to set the initial point or the pivot point. Okay, I can let up from my cursor and my Control key, rotate to basically set my symmetry plane. Essentially, that's what this is, a localized symmetry plane. Okay, so that red dot is going to be where it's copying from. So now I'll just click one time and I can continue brushing. As we'll see here momentarily, we do have the ability to copy from across a world space symmetry plane, but this just allows you to do it in a localized fashion. So I'll undo that. And inversion is very similar, except that you don't really have a plane. It essentially works in a radial fashion, just like this, as you can see. And it's exactly 180 degrees opposite of this pivot point at all times, no matter what. Okay, so again, I'll just Control click to set that initial pivot point, and it's 180 degrees away. Okay, so let's look at the next one. Clone sector. Now this one, instead of being 180 degrees, is actually going to be 90 degrees. So let's go back to the default, which is 4. So I'm going to reset my pivot point by Control clicking. You can let up from both my cursor and my Control key. And you can see when I move directly to the left, you can see my clone point goes at 90 degrees away. Likewise here, if I go to the 6 o'clock, it's coming out at the 9 o'clock. If I go to the 3 o'clock, it's coming out at the 6 o'clock, and so on. And this can be very handy when you are trying to clean up some seams, but you don't want it to look too conspicuous. So you can change how it moves. Instead of clockwise, you can change it to be counterclockwise. And you can set the depth opacity and the color opacity. You can also work through all layers instead of just on this one layer. Also, it works for all 3 channels simultaneously. One additional thing I should note is that you can add a number of sectors. Let's go up to 8. And so all that does is really, it just brings that copying point a little closer. And instead of 90 degrees, it's actually more like 45 degrees. As you can see, if I move it 6 o'clock, it's coming out at about 8 o'clock. So we'll set it back to 4. The next one is Symmetrical Copy. And if you don't already have symmetry enabled, you'll get this warning saying, hey, you need to enable the symmetry plane. Do you want to go ahead and do that now? Yes. And so you could set it to whichever symmetry plane you want. It's pretty self-explanatory. As you can see, I have this texture on one side, and all I really need to do is just paint where I want the new color or the new texture applied. So let's go ahead and do that now. Let's just paint over here. And using a stamp tool, that's really not what I intended. I intended to use the brush. So you got to be a little careful sometimes that you check the ePanel draw mode that you're currently in. Okay, so all right, so I'm going to do that a few times. So now I'm going to go ahead and turn symmetry plane off, no symmetry. And I guess it wants to leave symmetry on as long as I'm in this tool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose copy using pen. And now I'm going to turn symmetry off. When you first attempt to use this mode, it's going to ask you to set the topological symmetry first. And this just allows you to set the symmetry point on a mesh arbitrarily using a polygon selection. You have the ability to choose, whether to copy using pen or mark by polygons. We'll look at this tool in more depth later on, but this model is relatively symmetrical. So all I have to do is just pick the red face and pick the blue face. That tells 3D Coat where the symmetry line is supposed to be. Let me go ahead and break it up just a little bit. I'll pick the red face here and then the blue face. And so you can see it offsets it somewhat. So now that this is done, I can go back to the clone tool here, copy using pen. And so now as I start brushing, it's off center a little bit, as you can see here. Okay, it's not perfectly symmetrical. So let me undo that. And I'll just go back to topological symmetry here. And again, I'll just pick the red, pick the blue. It's just that simple. Go back to clone. And now as I brush, you can see it's perfectly symmetrical. Okay, so that is the clone stamp tool in 3D Coat. In the next video, we will pick up with the transform copy tool. So stay tuned, and thank you for watching.